I don't believe you have to do that. I believe they can be regenerated. I believe you can bring back that loving feeling. But before we get to that, what I want to talk about is why and how feelings fade. And I want to go back to the story of Dan and Marcy and tell their story from each of their perspectives so you can see what happened to them. Because what happens to them, what happened to them is what happens to all of us in one form or fashion. So what happened to their love? How did their eros and phileo grow cold? First of all, from Dan's perspective. Dan believes that their problems really started around the birth of their first child. Marcy, from his perspective, stopped giving him time and attention. The baby seemed to get all the attention. Marcy always seemed tired and moody and didn't want to be physically intimate as much. And she often seemed frustrated or needy. Marcy also gained some weight, and she didn't seem as interested in taking care of herself or the house as much. Dan began to feel neglected and even jealous of the baby. You know, when we had our first child, I felt exactly the same way. I should have been happy that we had a child, but you know what? I went into a depression for 6 months. I was the oldest child. I was used to getting attention. I was used to having my wife's full attention. The baby comes, all of a sudden my attention is cut in half. If I was lucky, I got half. I was depressed. Now, I know you'll say, well, that's sick. Well, most of the men that I know, they go through some of the same things. Do any of y'all can relate to that, or y'all just think I'm a bad person? Well, Dan began to feel neglected and even jealous of the baby. As a result, now listen closely, as a result, Dan began to think and believe. Say, think and believe. Dan began to think and believe that Marcy didn't love him or desire him anymore. He began to think and believe that Marcy didn't love him or desire him anymore. Well, he wasn't good at communicating his feelings in the first place, and with the baby and the demands of his job, the time never seemed right to discuss his concerns. So he just stuffed his feelings and pulled away from her emotionally. Occasionally, he would lose his temper and he would say really hurtful things to Marcy when she didn't respond at his attempts at physical intimacy. He felt rejected by her, and though he desperately needed her and wanted to be close to her again, he withdrew and walled himself off more and more. Well, what about from Marcy's perspective? This, of course, is the right perspective. As we know, the women are always right. Marcy was thrilled to have a new baby with her husband, her soulmate, her lover, the man of her dreams. She desperately wanted Dan to share in this joyous experience with her, but she soon realized that raising a child was much more demanding than she thought it would be, and much more difficult. The baby didn't sleep well at night. Breastfeeding was difficult. She also experienced problems with her hormones and tended to be moody. She often felt tired, lonely, and overwhelmed. She looked so forward to Dan coming home at the end of the day because she missed him, but also she looked forward to getting some help with her child, with their child. Marcy knew Dan had just been promoted in his new job and that longer hours were necessary to get accustomed to his new responsibilities, but she grew increasingly more aggravated and resentful when he would come home tired and stressed night after night. She wanted him to be there for her, to take care of her, to share the load, to be excited about the baby. Though he seemed to love the baby and was glad to see her, he did very little to help with the diapers and the feedings. He never offered to get up with the baby at night. He often seemed aggravated if the baby didn't go to bed earlier, that the house was messy, or that she was tired. He seemed to talk less and go to sleep earlier. Can you relate? Marcy felt lonely. She desperately wanted to feel connected emotionally. She didn't feel like being sexual. Surely he could understand that. Surely he could understand that. Surely he must realize she was tired because of continuous sleep deprivation. Surely he knew that. Certain comments and angry outbursts by Dan about the lack of physical intimacy and about her needing to sleep during the day with the baby so she could have energy for him at night hurt Marcy deeply. As a result, and remember this, as a result of all those experiences, Marcy began to think and believe. Say, think and believe. Marcy began to think and believe that all Dan cared about was himself and his needs, that he cared more about sex than her. Marcy even began to believe that Dan resented the baby because he seemed to get angry if the baby was sick or if they couldn't do something as a couple because of the baby. She began to think and believe that all he cared about was himself, that he cared more about sex than her, and that he was resentful of the baby. Marcy tried to talk about it on occasion, but her words never seemed to come out right. Dan just seemed to hear her words as criticism or complaining, and usually reacted badly. He seemed to be pulling away from her. She felt desperate and abandoned. She began to feel angry. When she went back to work full-time, things got worse. She was even more busy, and she was even more tired and exhausted and had less time for Dan. She got to the point where she didn't even want to have time for him. Can you relate? There are two main points that I want to make, if you'll turn to your outline again, as to why and how love fades.